My name is Ava Holloway. I'm 34 years old, and at 6:12 on a Thursday night, while standing in a hospital service corridor still wearing my badge and a blazer that smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic, I listened to a voicemail that should have shattered me. Instead, it clarified everything. My mother's voice was ice cold, polished, controlled, the same voice she used when she wanted to sound righteous in front of strangers. "You're cut off. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." Then she hung up like she was delivering a verdict, not abandoning her own daughter. I stood there staring at the cinder block wall while a janitor pushed a cart past me and a code alarm echoed somewhere down the hall. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I replayed it once, then twice, because I needed to hear the contempt clearly enough to stop lying to myself about what my family had become. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had finally said aloud what they had been practicing for years. I was only useful when I was solving their emergencies, signing their forms, cleaning up their messes, and making their lives look respectable from the outside. The second I stopped being convenient, I became disposable. So I texted one word back. "Okay." By 8 o'clock the next morning, access was locked, a house deal was dead, and the first crack in their perfect little future had already split wide open. Before I tell you what she said next, and why their lawyer ended up begging me to pick up the phone, tell me what time it is where you are, and where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels before it hits someone who's lived it too. Here's what my mother didn't understand when she sent that message. She thought she was discarding the family disappointment. What she actually cut off was the one person who knew where every fragile support beam was hidden inside the house they were pretending would never collapse. I wasn't some ATM with feelings. I was the one who spent 6 years quietly untangling every financial emergency they created and then disguised as temporary bad luck. My background wasn't in banking or real estate. I worked in forensic compliance for hospital foundations and private care networks, which meant I was very good at identifying where money was supposed to go, where it actually went, and what happened when people thought a signature from a trusted relative could clean up a dirty trail. My family had never respected that work, but they loved what it could do for them. Over time, I became the one who reviewed contracts they didn't read, corrected tax exposure they didn't understand, structured payment plans they couldn't sustain, and translated consequences into language they could ignore. The latest mess involved a luxury downsizing move my parents had been bragging about for months, selling the old family property, rolling bridge funds through a temporary escrow arrangement, and closing on a high-end gated townhouse near the lake. They were telling friends it was a fresh chapter. What they weren't saying was that the bridge only existed because I had agreed, against my better judgment, to oversee the legal access chain, confirm source of funds documentation, and maintain shared authorization over 2 linked accounts until closing. Not ownership, not theft, not anything dramatic and illegal like the fake stories online. Just the very real kind of administrative trust people exploit when they assume you'll never stop rescuing them. At 7:43 the next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open, my coffee untouched, and my mother's voicemail playing in my head like a metronome. Then I did exactly what a competent professional does when a hostile party explicitly severs contact while still depending on her legal cooperation. I withdrew my participation. I notified the title coordinator that I was no longer serving as verification contact for the source documentation package. I informed the broker, in writing, that I revoked my authorization to communicate on the transaction. I flagged the shared access credentials for immediate suspension pending identity revalidation. I also sent a short, perfectly professional note to the family accountant stating that any document previously routed through me would need to be reissued without my credentials, my review chain, or my indemnification language attached. No yelling, no threats, no revenge speech, Just a series of lawful withdrawals from systems that only functioned because I was in them. And then the consequences started landing faster than I expected. The townhouse closing was delayed within an hour because the seller's side refused to proceed with incomplete verification on a time-sensitive transfer. A restoration contractor my father had already hired for the old property put their move-out schedule on hold because the deposit confirmation didn't clear in the form expected. A private care facility my mother had been courting for my grandmother's temporary transition requested updated payment assurances before reserving the suite she'd been flaunting to her friends. That last detail made me go still, because it was the first clue that this wasn't just about another upscale relocation fantasy. They were moving my grandmother, too, and they had been doing it with a level of financial overconfidence that only made sense if they believed I would cushion every landing. By noon, the first call came through. I let it ring. Then another. Then 6 more. Funny how quickly "don't contact us again" turns into "why aren't you answering?" when the paperwork stops moving. Have you ever noticed that some families only believe in boundaries when they're the ones drawing them? I didn't hear my mother's voice first. I heard panic wearing my father's voice like a cheap suit. He left 2 voicemails before lunch, trying to sound measured and failing both times. There's been a misunderstanding. Then, 20 minutes later, you need to call us. Today. By 3 p.m., the tone had changed from strained dignity to raw alarm. The title company says there's a hold. Patricia says you pulled authorizations. I don't know what game you're playing, but this has to be fixed before end of day. I saved the messages and went back to work. I was reviewing an audit trail for a donor-funded oncology wing when my phone lit up again and again on the desk beside me, each vibration more frantic than the last. I remember looking down at the screen and seeing the family group chat suddenly active after weeks of silence, as if my existence had been restored only because their timeline was collapsing. That evening, I finally opened the messages. My sister didn't ask what happened, she accused. How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated. Do you even understand the damage? There it was, the familiar family logic. Their choices, my fault. Their lies, my burden. Their embarrassment, my emergency. I almost answered, but then a voicemail transcription came through from my mother, and I read it twice because the hypocrisy was so perfect it felt scripted. She called me vindictive, unstable, and ungrateful in the same breath she demanded I fix the paperwork issue immediately. No apology for cutting me off. No acknowledgement that she had told me not to contact them again. Just outrage that I had taken her at her word. The part that changed everything came later that night when I reviewed an email thread I'd nearly ignored. It was from the care liaison at the private residence my mother had been using to relocate my grandmother. They weren't asking me to pay anything. They were asking me to confirm whether the funding structure previously described by the family was still valid, because the deposit had been represented as tied to proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which in turn depended on the old property sale, which now appeared to be stalled. The liaison was careful and professional, but the implication was brutal. My mother had been shopping around for prestige care she couldn't actually secure, without stacking one unstable promise on top of another. She had built the entire chain on my reliability, then cut me off as if I were the problem. 2 days after the voicemail, I had 58 missed calls, not 79, not some inflated number for drama. 58. And every one of them mattered, because each one marked the speed at which control was draining from people who had spent years treating me like a backup generator they could kick when the lights went out. The calls came from my parents, my sister, 2 unknown numbers, a broker, and a contractor. Then, at 8:17 p.m., I got the message that made me understand there was more at stake than a delayed closing. It was from a law office. Ms. Holloway, this is Graham Pike representing your parents. We have a serious problem and need to speak tonight. I stared at the screen. Then at the old voicemail from my mother, then back again. Serious problem. Those words hit different when they come from someone who bills by the hour. I typed back exactly 6 words. Enjoy moving forward. You said that first. Psych. Then I put my phone face down and let them sit in the silence they had tried to give me. What would you do when the same people who cast you out suddenly need your name attached to their survival? The next morning, I learned what the serious problem was, and it wasn't just a house. It was reputation, leverage, and the kind of paper trail people assume no one inside the family will ever expose. Graham Pike called again from a new number, and this time I answered because lawyers don't get theatrical unless something expensive is on fire. He was careful with his wording at first, almost annoyingly calm. He said there had been unexpected complications tied to the property sequence, to the assisted living reservation, and to certain statements made to third parties regarding available liquidity. I asked him to speak plainly. There was a pause. Then he did. My parents had already presented themselves to the seller, the care facility, and at least one social board as fully funded for a major lifestyle transition. My mother, who sat on the fundraising committee for a boutique elder care charity, had apparently leveraged that image everywhere. She had promised a sponsorship package, hinted at a hosting event in the new townhouse, and told people the family was consolidating assets smoothly. Except the liquidity wasn't smooth. It was brittle. My father had been carrying business debt I didn't know existed. My sister had quietly maxed out a joint emergency line that was supposed to remain untouched, and the old property needed repairs serious enough to scare off a price-sensitive buyer if disclosed too late. They weren't moving from strength. They were scrambling before everyone noticed. I asked Graham the only question that mattered. Did anyone forge my review or imply I was still overseeing this after I withdrew? His silence told me more than his answer did. He said some parties may have relied on prior understandings involving my role. That's lawyer language for someone got comfortable using my credibility after they no longer had my consent. My chest went cold then, not with rage, but with certainty. I told him I would communicate only in writing. He started pushing, mentioning family stress, my grandmother's transition, my mother's blood pressure, the sensitivity of the matter. I cut him off. A serious problem for them does not create an obligation for me. Then I hung up. The rest unraveled in pieces. A member of the charity board forwarded me, accidentally or deliberately, a draft invitation for a donor evening hosted by my mother in the not-yet-purchased townhouse. The event copy praised the Holloway family's continued commitment to dignified elder support, which would have been nauseating under any circumstances, but especially knowing my grandmother was being moved around like a decorative object in a branding campaign built on unsecured money. I also discovered that my sister had told multiple people I was handling the compliance side of the transition, a phrase vague enough to sound impressive and false enough to expose me if things went wrong. That's when the story stopped being about hurt feelings and became about self-preservation. If their fantasy collapsed publicly while my name floated around in the background, I wouldn't just be the daughter they used. I'd be the professional whose credibility got dragged through their vanity project. So I gathered everything. The voicemail where my mother cut me off, the timestamps of my revocations, the email confirming my withdrawal from all authorizations, the care facility's request for updated assurances, the event draft, the messages from my sister. I compiled them in a clean folder the way I would build any case file, not to destroy them recklessly, to make sure the truth had structure if I ever needed it. That afternoon, my mother finally stopped pretending to be offended and showed me who she really was. She called from a blocked number, and when I answered, she didn't say hello. She hissed, "How dare you embarrass us like this? Not how dare you abandon family. Not why are you doing this? Embarrass us." That was the center of her universe. I told her the embarrassment came from building a public life on promises she couldn't afford to keep. She snapped that everything they did had been for the family, that I was selfish, cold, impossible to love lately. Then she made the mistake that burned away the last of my hesitation. She said, "After everything we sacrificed, you owed us cooperation." Owed. There it was. Not love, not trust. Debt. The same debt they had been collecting since I was 21 and the first in the family to understand contracts, deadlines, and consequences. You wanted the villains to be clearer? This was the moment. Because the truth is, their cruelty didn't start with one voicemail. It started years earlier when my father borrowed from my graduate fund to save face on a failed investment, and I was told not to be dramatic. It deepened when my mother pressured me to skip a fellowship interview to help her stage a charity luncheon she wanted photographed for local press. It hardened when my sister cried on my couch about overdue bills, took the money I wired, and posted poolside vacation photos 3 weeks later. Every time I objected, they called me harsh. Every time I fixed it, they called me family. Some of you already know exactly what kind of trap that is. 3 nights later, the whole thing detonated in public, just not the way my mother expected. Remember that donor event draft? The one she was circulating before she even owned the property she planned to flaunt? It turned out she hadn't canceled the actual committee reception tied to that campaign. She'd only changed the venue back to the charity's historic conservatory and told everyone the location shift was due to logistical refinements. A mutual contact sent me the updated invitation with a single line underneath. "You may want to know what's being said about you." I almost ignored it. Then I read the attachment. My mother had been introducing herself to donors as a caregiver under extraordinary strain, a woman carrying both her aging mother's future and the burden of an estranged daughter who has chosen resentment over responsibility. She wasn't just privately cutting me out, she was publicly rewriting the story before the collapse could land on her. So I went. I didn't go in a red dress to make a scene. I didn't arrive with security or a folder under my arm like some soap opera avenger. I went exactly the way people least expect trouble to arrive: calm, early, and dressed like someone who belongs in rooms where lies are expected to hold their posture. The conservatory was full of glass, winter greenery, polished wood, and wealthy people pretending empathy over past champagne. I saw my mother across the room immediately, smiling with that charitable softness she only used when there were witnesses. My father stood near the donor wall looking 20 years older than he had a week earlier. My sister was laughing too loudly beside a trustee I recognized from a regional health board. Then my mother saw me, and for one perfect second, her entire face forgot how to perform. She crossed the room fast, teeth clenched behind a smile. "Why are you here?" she asked, barely moving her lips. I said, "I was invited into the story you've been telling." She tried to guide me toward a side corridor, but two women turned at the tension in her voice, so she kept smiling. "This is not the place," I answered, just as softly. "You made it the place when you used my name to hold your version together." That rattled her. She hissed that everyone already knew I'd been difficult, unstable, and vindictive since pulling support during a family crisis. I asked whether by support she meant my credibility, my labor, or the authorizations she kept using after cutting me off. That landed harder than I thought because my father, standing only a few feet away, looked straight at the floor. My sister rushed in next, all brittle panic and expensive perfume. "Can you not do this here?" she muttered. "Mom is barely keeping it together." I looked at her and remembered every time she had weaponized tears to outsource the consequences of her choices. "Interesting," I said, "because I seem to remember all of you being very committed to moving forward without me." She grabbed my arm. That was her mistake. Not because it hurt, because people saw it. A trustee turned, then a donor couple, then one of the event coordinators, who already looked overworked and suspicious. My mother immediately changed tactics and raised her voice half a notch, just enough to sound wounded, not enough to sound guilty. Ava, please. This is about your grandmother. That line was meant to make me look monstrous if I didn't fold. Instead, I said the quietest thing in the room. Then let's talk about Grandma. Silence moves differently in rich spaces. It doesn't slam, it freezes. I asked my mother whether the care residents had been told the deposit relied on a closing that hadn't happened. I asked my father whether the seller knew the old property repairs were more extensive than originally represented. I asked my sister whether she had or had not told people I was still handling compliance after I revoked that role in writing. No screaming, no theatrics, just questions sharp enough to puncture the image they had inflated around themselves. My mother tried to shut me down by calling me cruel. My father said this was private. My sister started crying on command. But by then, the wrong people were listening. One trustee stepped closer and asked, gently but unmistakably, "Was Ms. Holloway not involved in the transition after all?" I turned to him and said, "Not after I was told not to contact them again. I have the voicemail, the withdrawal notices, and the timestamps if anyone needs clarity." My mother went white. Not angry white. Cornered white. She knew exactly what mattered in that room. Not morality, not family loyalty, but documented inconsistency. Within minutes, the board chair had pulled her aside. The event coordinator whispered to someone from legal. My father looked like he might be sick. My sister kept saying this was a misunderstanding, but her mascara was running and no one important was comforting her. That still wasn't the hardest hit. The hardest hit came from a woman I'd met only twice before, an older donor with the kind of money that doesn't need to raise its voice. She looked at my mother and said, very evenly, "Patricia, were charitable commitments discussed before your own household obligations were stable?" It was such a precise sentence that it sliced the room in half, because everybody there understood what it really meant. Had she been performing generosity with money she did not control, while her private obligations were held together by a daughter she had just publicly vilified? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. I left before the spectacle could cheapen itself, but I didn't leave empty-handed. As I walked out, Graham Pike intercepted me near the coat check with no trace of his earlier composure. He asked if we could please resolve matters quietly. Quietly. Another favorite word people use when they mean before the consequences become permanent. I told him I had no interest in spectacle, only distance and accuracy. He said my parents were now facing the collapse of the property sale, scrutiny from the charity board, and a possible complaint over misrepresentations tied to a care contract. I looked at him and said, "That sounds serious." Then I took my coat and went home. Let me ask you something. When a family uses your silence as building material for their lies, is speaking up revenge or just self-defense at last? Public embarrassment didn't fix me. It didn't send me dancing through my apartment, healed and triumphant, the way cheap revenge stories like to pretend. It left me wired, nauseated, and unable to sleep. I kept replaying the scene in the conservatory, not because I regretted telling the truth, but because people like my family train you to feel guilty the moment you stop absorbing the impact for them. All weekend, my phone buzzed with shifting tactics. My father sent a text saying my mother's blood pressure had spiked and that, whatever this is, had gone too far. My sister wrote 3 paragraphs about trauma, loyalty, and how I was punishing everyone over a communication issue. My mother alternated between silence and brief, venomous messages implying I had destroyed my grandmother's future out of spite. Not one of them acknowledged the actual order of events. She cut me off. They continued leaning on my role. I withdrew properly, and their own false front collapsed under its own weight. I didn't go to therapy with a wise boyfriend who wrapped the lesson up in one sentence. I went because my hands were shaking when I opened my inbox and because I realized something ugly. Even after all this, some part of me still wanted permission to stop rescuing them. I met with a trauma therapist named Dr. Elise Mercer, and she did not flatter me with cliches about empowerment. She asked me one question that lodged in my ribs. When did your family first teach you that usefulness was the price of belonging? I sat there for a long time before answering. I was 13 when my mother started making me mediate arguments between her and my father because I was the calm one. 16 when I began reading loan paperwork out loud because adults in my house preferred optimism to details. 21 when I was told that delaying my plans for 1 year to stabilize the family was noble. 28 when I realized there would never be a final emergency, just a rotating cast of disasters tied together by entitlement. Dr. Mercer didn't tell me to forgive. She told me to document my reality so I wouldn't let other people narrate me out of it. So I did. I wrote down the old incidents I had minimized for years. The graduate fund quietly siphoned, the fellowship opportunity sabotaged, the temporary caregiving duties that turned into unpaid project management for every crisis my parents manufactured. The way my sister learned that tears could reroute money and labor in her direction faster than honesty ever could. Once it was on paper, the pattern stopped looking like family chaos and started looking like systematic extraction. Then came the confrontation at the old house. My father asked to meet, said he wanted one adult conversation without shouting. Against my better judgment, I went. But I didn't go alone in the emotional sense. I brought dates, screenshots, and a mind finally anchored to facts. The house looked half-packed and haunted. Designer chairs wrapped in moving blankets, art missing from the walls, cracks in the entry trim that had apparently been minor 2 weeks earlier, now impossible to ignore. My mother was at the dining table before I walked in, as composed as a defendant who still thinks charm might work on the jury. My sister was there too, red-eyed and furious. So much for a private talk. For the first 10 minutes, they tried revisionism. My mother said the voicemail had been sent in anger and not meant literally. My father said everyone had been under pressure. My sister claimed no one misused my name, only assumed continuity. Then I put printed timestamps on the table, one by one. Revocation notice, title correspondence, accountant email, care liaison inquiry, event draft. My mother's public comments relayed to me by a board member. The room changed. Facts do that. They take all the warm ambiguity manipulative people hide inside and strip it for parts. That's when their real selves finally surfaced. My mother slammed her hand on the table and said, I had always enjoyed making them feel small because I was the only one who understood how systems work. My father snapped that none of this would have happened if I had simply helped the family instead of acting superior. My sister blurted out the truth by accident. You always act like the money was yours. I looked at her and said, not the money, the consequences. No one answered because that was the heart of it. They wanted access without accountability, image without solvency, dependence without gratitude. And then, buried inside a rage-fueled monologue, my mother revealed the ugliest thing she had ever said to me. She admitted they had expected me to put my own condo purchase on hold that year because someone responsible had to act like an adult. Not ask. Expected. She talked about my life as if it were family inventory, something to be reallocated. A room went very still inside me then. Not broken. Still. The kind of stillness that comes when the last excuse dies. I told them I was done. Not for a week. Not until they calmed down. Done. I would not restore access. I would not attach my name to any transaction. I would not intervene with the charity board, the care residents, the broker, or the accountant. If they wanted to explain their own misrepresentations, they could finally hear themselves do it. My father called that cruel. My mother said I was abandoning blood. My sister whispered that I'd regret this when Grandma suffered. I told them the person who endangered Grandma was the one who used her as social proof for a move they couldn't afford. Then I stood up and left while they were still shouting. The fallout took 6 weeks, and it was uglier than even I expected. The old property sale didn't just stumble. It collapsed after the buyer demanded deeper disclosures and a repair credit my parents couldn't absorb. The lakefront townhouse was gone within days, sold to another buyer with cleaner paperwork and actual liquidity. The private care residents withdrew the reservation after inconsistent financial representations triggered internal review. My mother was quietly asked to step back from the charity's Elder Support Committee, pending clarification of recent concerns, which in polished social language means the room no longer trusts you near its money or image. My sister's already fragile lifestyle cracked next. The joint emergency line she'd drained became impossible to hide once no one else was plugging holes for her, and the boyfriend she'd been impressing with curated luxury apparently had strong opinions about honesty once collection notices got involved. My father, who had spent years floating above consequences with tired dignity, ended up taking consulting work he used to sneer at just to stop the debt from snowballing. And my grandmother? That was the one thing I refused to let them weaponize. I did not swoop in and rescue the whole family. I did something far more controlled. Through a separate, documented channel, and only after confirming that doing so would not root me back into their financial circus, I helped secure a modest, reputable placement for her through a social worker contact unconnected to my parents' vanity plans. No luxury brochure, no donor dinner storyline, just safe care, honest numbers, and people who understood dignity doesn't require marble countertops and ribbon-cutting language. When my mother found out, she called me shrieking that I had humiliated her by downgrading Grandma's future. That word told me everything I needed to know. To her, care had always been image first, human needs second. What changed in me wasn't that I became hard, it was that I became unavailable for distortion. I stopped reading every message. I routed all legal or financial communication into a folder and responded only when necessary, in writing, with no emotional openings. I told extended relatives a short version of the truth before my mother could finish painting me as unstable. Some believed me immediately because, as it turns out, people had noticed more than I realized. Others didn't. That was fine. One of the strange freedoms of finally stepping out of a family role is realizing you do not have to win every audience. You only have to stop volunteering as the stage. About a month later, Graham Pike contacted me again. Not to threaten, not to negotiate restoration, but to ask whether I would sign a statement clarifying the timeline of my withdrawal from all family-related transactions. Not for my parents' benefit, for containment. The board, the care facility, and one lender all wanted the sequence documented. I signed a precise statement that did one thing only. It separated my name from their conduct. No embellishment, no revenge monologue, just a clean record. That was more devastating than any scream could have been, because once the facts were fixed, they couldn't keep smearing me as the cause of damage they had engineered themselves. Then came the last meeting, the one that could have turned this into a soft, recycled reconciliation story if I were a different woman. My mother asked to see me in person, not at a cafe with sunlight and wistful music. At her attorney's office because by then even she understood everything important between us now required witnesses. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to hear once whether she was capable of saying a true thing without wrapping it in self-pity. She looked smaller than I remembered, but not humbled in the beautiful, healing way people romanticize, Smaller in the practical way consequences shrink people who thought they were exempt. She didn't apologize first. She started with hardship, how stressed they had been, how embarrassed, how much had been lost. I let her speak until she ran out of rearrangements and had no choice but to face the obvious. Then I said, "You told me not to contact you again. I respected that. You kept using what I built after pushing me out. That is why everything broke." She tried crying then. Real tears, maybe. But tears aren't truth. They're only weather. My father stared at the table. My sister wasn't there. Apparently, even she knew the performance wouldn't hold. Finally, my mother asked the question she should have asked years earlier, though not for noble reasons. She asked, "Is there anything we can do to fix this?" And there it was. The fantasy opening every toxic family hopes will still be available after they've burned through every other bridge. The magic sentence where the useful daughter provides a map back to normal. I looked at her for a long moment and realized the answer was no, not because I'm cruel, but because some structures should stay collapsed. You do not rebuild a house on top of a sinkhole just because the people who ignored the warning signs finally got scared. So I told her the truth they hated most. "You can't fix this with me. You can only live with what you did without turning me into the repair crew again." My mother flinched like I had struck her. My father finally spoke and asked if this meant I was cutting them off forever. I said, "No, you did that first. I'm just refusing to crawl back into the opening." Then I stood, gathered my coat, and walked out of the office while my mother called my name in the voice she used when she expected history to reverse itself for her comfort. It didn't. The final update, for anyone wondering whether they ever truly paid the price, is this. My mother lost her committee role and most of the social capital she had built around performative generosity. My father sold the old house months later for less than they had bragged about, after repairs he could no longer pretend were cosmetic. My sister downsized fast and disappeared from the circles she used to posture in. The family narrative, that I was unstable, bitter, vindictive, never fully recovered once people realized I had been the quiet infrastructure beneath their respectability all along. Turns out panic ensues when the person doing invisible labor finally becomes visible only long enough to leave. As for me, I bought my condo that fall. The one they once expected me to postpone because someone else's mess mattered more than my future. I signed alone, with no group chat, no family blessing, no dramatic phone call. Just a clean pen, a clean title, and the kind of silence that feels earned instead of punishing. Some people think revenge has to look like shouting, public ruin, or one perfect line delivered under chandeliers. Sometimes it looks like documentation, boundaries, and the refusal to keep your enemies warm just because they share your last name. Sometimes the deepest revenge is letting people experience the full weight of a life they built on top of your unpaid loyalty. So tell me honestly, if your own family cut you off, kept using your name, and only panicked when the system stopped working without you, would you have gone back? Or would you have let them enjoy moving forward all by themselves? My personal view on this story is that it is not just about family revenge. It is really about the moment someone finally stops being the emotional and financial safety net for people who only value them when they are